So this week we are going to continue in our journey of Lent. We're obviously almost to Easter. We have a few more weeks of these traditional readings that are leading us up to this important event in the life of the church, of when Jesus both died and was resurrected. The themes on kind of the traditional readings this week seem to be the idea of God's restorative powers, the fact that God can bring life out of death in almost any situation. He can bring something good out of almost anything that is bad. Specifically, I'll be looking at something out of Isaiah chapter 43. In this section of Isaiah, I get to read a fairly positive section, but the overall context in Isaiah is feels a little more bipolar. It's swinging back and forth between both God pointing out, I can bring life out of this difficult situation, which in their case was the exile, the predicted exile, that they had lost their homeland. They had lost God's protection due to their own, unfaithfulness to Him and following His ways, and so they were overwhelmed politically. But then also that theme of that they bear some responsibility. So yes, God is good. God is doing things in their lives, but it needs to be lived in a certain way. And so I kind of have that in the back of my mind as I'm reading this. Just the fact that it can be easy to understand the idea, like theologically or in the abstract, that God can bring life out of death, can bring new things out of old things, but to actually live that reality responsibly is sometimes a little more tricky. So I'm going to read from Isaiah chapter 43, starting 16 through verses 21. Thus said the Lord, who makes a way in the sea and a path in fierce waters, who leads out chariot and horse to destruction, all the fierce forces, they lay down to rise no more, flickered out like a wick, were extinguished. Do not recall the first things, and what came before do not consider. I am about to do a new thing. Now it will spring forth, and you shall know it. I will make a way in the desert, paths in the wasteland. The beast of the field shall honor me, the jackals and the ostriches, for I have put water in the desert, rivers in the wasteland, to give drink to my people, my chosen, the people I fashioned for me. My acclaim they shall renown. So the first section there, when it's talking about kind of the old things, we hear the strong biblical theme. It says, who makes a way in the sea, a path through fierce waters, who led the chariot and horse to destruction in all their fierce forces. It's obviously a reference to the Exodus story, to the fact that when God's people under Moses were trapped, he did a miracle. He opens up the ocean, makes a path through the water, and then when Pharaoh and his armies try to follow, the waters come crashing down on them again, saving the people of Israel from this incredible disaster, saving them from this incredible army without having to lift a finger. There's also a lot of references in here, as is in the original Exodus story, to kind of the assumptions that people had at the time this was written about how the world was created. The kind of just the language, the way of thinking they inherited was, as a desert people, water often represented, chaos and the stormy seas, things that could not be controlled. And so in a lot of the creation mythology, and the Bible plays with this imagery, there's the idea of the chaos is fought back and the chaos is restrained and ordered. And so both the Exodus story and this passage have some kind of references to that as well. I think it's also important to remember that this is a historical reality that's being talked about here. For the people of Israel, they existed as a nation. Their entire identity as a people came from this event. And so the story of who they were came from, we are the children of people who experience this thing. And so I think we are offered an opportunity to reflect in Lent on, okay, what is our story of God? What has God done in our world and in our lives? How do we tell this story? Again, the people of Israel said, we are people who were slaves and we were rescued, we were chosen um, to act and live in a certain way, right? So we need to ask ourselves, like, what is it that God has done? How do we tell that story of both our lives up until this point, and how do we tell the story of what God has done in our lives? Do we tell a story of, well, I started in hardship, and God helped me overcome these things? Do we tell a story that's like, no, I was given a very safe and stable upbringing in an environment. I later walked away from that, and yet God rescued me, kept me from too much trouble. Do we have, each of us has different stories, ways we tell it. And I think for those of us who are people of faith, we have different ways of describing how God has been part of that, the things He's brought us through, the way we have been made that we are today. And that becomes a foundation that helps us kind of reinterpret the current circumstances that were part of our lives. And I think that's very much what God is reminding these people of as He begins talking with them. The problem, of course, in this story is that this story of God being someone who rescues, God being someone who is, changing world history for their benefit, this doesn't square with their experiences of reality at the moment. That homeland they were promised that was such a gift is gone. They've lost it. And whether it's kind of their own fault or not, it can be a little hard to say we are the people who God has rescued when we are no longer rescued, right? And so I think when we find ourselves in these difficult times, when reality does not square with the stories we tell about ourselves or we tell about God, in some ways we have kind of two choices. One is kind of just hunkering down and just saying, no, this is how God does things. This is what needs to happen. Therefore, I'm going to do this. And, there are times for that. But I also think we can be careful because we can, over time, begin to expect God to act in certain ways. And in some ways, we can lose the ability to see what God is actually doing because we have strong expectations. We're caught in the past, the ways God has acted. We're caught in our story. This is, of course, sadly what happened to so many people in Jesus' day. They had such strong assumptions about who God was and how He had acted in the past and how they were supposed to act now. They completely missed the fact that God was among them, that God was stretching them and doing this new act as well, right? I think I ran into a kind of a frightening quote in my reading this week for this as well, and I think this kind of shows us the other scary version. Maybe it's just a variation, but this is the quote. It said, "The great danger to faith is becoming unable to expect anything really new from God." And so I think I hear there just something that's become cynical. Over time, we lose the ability to expect new things, really new things from God. That's a scary place, and it's one that I think God is rejecting the people who are stuck in this place. They are lamenting, they are saying this cannot be fixed. And God is responding to them, talking about this new work. Again, He says, don't recall the first things or the former things. And what came before, don't consider. I am about to do a new thing. Now it will spring forth, and you shall know it. I shall make a way in the desert, paths in the wasteland. The beasts of the field shall honor me, the jackals and the ostriches. For I have put water in the desert, rivers in the wasteland, to give drink to my people, my chosen. And so we've been talking a lot about kind of the former things and how I think in an ideal world we use kind of our past story, our past recognition of the way God has been moving, to reinterpret our reality now, to expect God to reenact in certain sorts of things. We know the sorts of things God is all about, right? But I was thinking and realizing the way God talks so much in the Bible. Whereas we use the past to kind of be a foundation and orient the present and often the future, I think God does the opposite. God seems to orient and interpret the present and who we are and His action in it by the future fullness. God seems to know of where of all of history is heading, right? God knows and he plans and he highlights and he acts in according ways. Um, the the only kind of metaphor I could come up with was the idea of a seed, right? If we don't know the future of a seed or a pit, we look at this thing and it, it's a big seed. It's just, it looks like a little rock. Like it's this hard little thing. If we didn't know any better, it would be hard to look at a seed and say, no, that's actually a tree. It's going to be a tree someday. And it's even harder to plan to build an orchard, like to plant an orchard, right? Knowing how big the trees are going to be, how far apart they have to be, what it looks like to help make them have enough sunlight and produce. And I think a lot of the time that's what God is doing. God is in fact planning towards the fullness that is possible. God is planning towards what things will be, which we can't even imagine because we haven't seen it yet all the way. And that's not to say that God doesn't take our current suffering seriously. It doesn't mean that he is not going to continue to act in consistent ways. But I think it means that God sees the present and he interprets the way he works in it by things future potential, things future fullness in a way that can be really hard for us to understand. And so we need to be caught off guard. We need to be reminded that God is constantly able to, and in some ways almost has to do, new things that will catch us off guard because he sees where this whole thing is headed in a way we can't even possibly imagine. At the same time, I think we need to recognize that God has given us the past as a foundation. He's given us this story, both our own and in the Bible, because there is a likeness, a similarity in the ways God will continue to work just like there is in the past. I mean, you look at this passage, again, I highlighted some of those kind of creation themes that were there because they come up again. Whereas before, God is, in the Exodus event, reminding of them that he's parting the waters representing chaos. Another strong place that they represented chaos and wildness, things that were outside of control that could be scary, was the wilderness. And so in this first act, God has created a way, a path of safety, and he has used the seas. He's now doing the same thing in the wilderness, right? I will make a way in the desert and paths through the wasteland. We've even got the theme of the water being here again, except in some ways it's been restored and redeemed. It's no longer salt water. It's no longer chaos. It's something that's bringing flourishing. It's something that's bringing life. And again, we see an expansion in this blessing, in this work, because it now includes, the beasts of the field, the jackals, the ostriches, the wild things that are out in these wild places, these places of chaos. They are now being included in the blessing as God blesses his people and does a new work. And again, before we consider this too abstractly, the reminder here is that this is a historical reality. God would, in fact, create a way home for his people. They would leave the exile. And so I think we need to remind ourselves that God isn't always interested in just the future where things are headed. God is interested in the now, in our current experiences. God is interested in working with historical realities, just like he's interested in working with people and historical problems that they experience. And so this theme is such an important one for understanding who God is and how God works. Like, whenever something is dead, God can still bring life out of it. In this case, there are dead ends. They feel like they have historically hit a cul-de-sac. We're not going anywhere. And God is making a way again. And here I love the fashioning language, the kind of creation language we've been talking about is actually used of his people and his future people, which includes those of us who follow him nowadays. He says, I'm doing all this to give drink to my people, my chosen, the people that I fashioned for myself. And the only response that we have in this passage, the only responsibility we have, my acclaim they shall recount. We have to watch, we have to acknowledge, we have to see it. And so I think this story, this familiar passage to many people about, I am going to do a new thing. It's going to spring forth and you shall know it. We need to just ask ourselves again, has Has our views of how God works and the types of things that he does, have they strangled our ability to be surprised by this new thing? Is there cynicism there? Are we struggling to even be at the point when we can't expect any truly new things from God? What does it look like to trust in a God who can do things that are beyond our imagination and surprise us, and to expect this restorative, redemptive work to be experienced now, no matter what the experiences of pain and suffering and confusion we face right now? It's a really beautiful reminder, especially as we're about to head into the hardest part of the story for Easter and for Holy Week, when God himself is going to be beaten and killed, right? These two things always have to be held in tension, that death never gets the final ending. Dead ends of history never get the final ending. God is doing a new thing, even now, just like he was that original Easter.